All right, everybody. Howdy. I self published a piece today on Medium, which I'm going to be in the habit of doing now more frequently than normal. I don't know if you happen to recall, but in late July, I did publish a self published Medium piece relating to the riots and my observations thereof. So, and that piece got quite a bit of pickup, and seems like people are interested in reading stuff in that form, in addition to the more conventional published items that I put out pretty regularly. And although the Republican convention just finished last night, this piece has more to do with the Democratic convention, kind of taking a broader view of the themes that were evident in that convention and what it says about the evolution of the party. First, I don't know if you're aware of this or if this ever occurred to you or if you think it's significant, but if you go and read the transcript of Barack Obama's acceptance speech at the 2008 convention, do you know that the words race, racism, and even black didn't appear once? Obama, the first black or even non-white nominee of a major party in U.S. history, didn't mention the word racism. And now, 12 years later, Obama's vice president is the nominee. He's an old white guy, so that already makes a number of people in the Democratic-aligned intelligentsia, commentariat, operative world queasy. And race becomes the dominant theme of the entire convention. I would say the level of emphasis placed on issues of race was on par with or even exceeded the pandemic, which really tells you how much weight they're placing on these issues. Even in Biden's acceptance speech, he emphatically declared his intention to finally root out what he called systemic racism. Now, that's a more contemporary coinage, systemic racism. You can debate the validity or lack thereof of the term, but it's entered common parlance only relatively recently, to the point that it would even be enunciated in one of the most significant speeches of Biden's entire life, if not the most up until this point. In fact, it is almost certainly the most significant speech he's yet delivered. And you have Joe Biden, the epitome of the old style, kind of almost transactional coalition manager Democrat, trafficking in this terminology, which gives you some insight into how rhetorical trends, at the very least, are manifesting in the party coalition. And in addition to the advanced racial rhetoric, the secondary theme in the Democratic coalition, and this is almost apt to go over after the Republican convention concluded yesterday, because it's the crux of what the case against Trump will be heading into now the big portion of the campaign after Labor Day. That's sort of the cliche as to when the race really begins. It's Labor Day. Is that true or not? Probably not, but let's just go with that shorthand. So you have the racial rhetoric where everybody's demanded to heighten their racial awareness. Some refer to that as woke. Detractors, I find, tend to use the phraseology of wokeness more so than the actual adherents to the woke ideology, those who have been awoken, but however you call it, that is now infiltrated much of Democratic mainstream rhetoric. And layered above that is this, what I would call, catastrophist depiction of Trump. Now, this isn't new. Trump has been talked about and portrayed in hyper catastrophist terms since the 2016 campaign. The minute that pundits and journalists and operatives came to believe that Trump could actually win the Republican nomination sometime in, I want to say, maybe the early spring or late winter of 2016, is the minute that all bets were off in terms of the tone, let's say, of the coverage that they were willing to apply to Trump. He's a fascist. He is a white nationalist. He's the avatar of the alt-right. Later, he's a Russian plant. He's only in office because he was installed through Russian subterfuge. He will bring about the collapse of democracy as we know it. Those are the themes that one heard at the Democratic convention last week. And if it sounds familiar, it's because those were pretty much the same themes during the 2016 campaign and then over the course of Trump's entire presidency. So if the person of Trump really could cause all the existential destruction that was prophesied, meaning our institutions would crumble, democracy would cease to exist, wouldn't that have happened by now? Because we're kind of now getting ready to collectively participate in yet another mass election. Now, will there be problems with the administration of the election? Likely, given the conversion to mail-in voting. Is there an arguable case that certain people are just going to be disenfranchised for whatever reason? Yeah, but that's been the case throughout U.S. history. And this kind of catastrophic significance has seldom been imparted to a sole figure in the way that it has been to Trump. The whole reason why everybody was supposed to get on board the impeachment bandwagon was because it was justified on almost identical grounds. It was a national emergency. It was a crisis. We needed to repudiate Trump through this extremely rare break window in case of emergency or break glass in cases of emergency mechanism. Because if we didn't do that, then he was going to get away with his criminal sabotage of democracy itself. And yet, take a look at the Democratic convention versus the Republican convention. Which one, do you wager, was more interested in bringing up the subject of impeachment? Does anybody even remember what impeachment entailed? Could you recite to me the precise reasons why Trump was impeached? Could you rattle off the allegations that were listed in those articles of impeachment that were passed in December of 2019? I doubt very many people could do it. I would almost even struggle to do it. I could do it under pressure now. And I was, immersed in the day-to-day developments of that story. Yet, I don't even think your average Democratic official really could explain what that all is about now. And so, as such, impeachment was totally ignored. It was as though it never happened in the Democratic convention. Not mentioned. Memory holes. That's the specialty of everybody who engages in these constant Trump histrionics. They move on to the next stage of histrionics and pretend that what preceded it just never happened. It's like a pathology. But the Republicans did bring it up. They elevated certain speakers to remind the viewing audience that this impeachment thing did happen, and which party seemingly got more political ammunition out of it? Apparently the Republicans, because they're the only ones who spoke about it. Elise Stefanik last night, the congresswoman from New York, who made a big name for herself by becoming a staunch Trump defender over the course of the impeachment ordeal, she was given a primetime speaking slot where she recalled the legacy of impeachment. Jeff Van Drew, congressman from New Jersey, who switched parties from Democrat to Republican in the wake of the impeachment saga, he got a primetime speaking slot. On the first night, Jim Jordan, congressman from Ohio, mentioned impeachment and Russiagate and Mueller, all of which he was pretty deeply involved in. And so, at the very least, you can surmise that the catastrophist impulses, which gave rise to the whole impeachment saga, which was connected to Russiagate, we don't have to rehearse that entire history, was more advantageous, or at least perceived as such, by Republicans. And maybe it's because you just foster a certain numbness after a while when every little thing that Trump does is cast in the most exaggerated, hysterical terms. Aren't we beyond that at this point? Apparently not. Barack Obama, at his convention speech this year, said that democracy is at stake. Well, gee, I went and found in about 2 seconds instances of him saying virtually the exact same thing in 2016, that democracy was on the ballot. Well, if democracy was on the ballot in 2016 and democracy was repudiated by the election of Trump, then what does that say about democracy? Like, I mean, was it on the ballot or not? Aren't we now engaged in a mass democratic exercise to choose the next president? It seems as though Democrats would like the public to believe that when they are rejected electorally, it's a rejection of democracy rather than of them. And whether the Democrats are the true defenders of democracy in the first place is highly dubious. Could give a very comprehensive list of all the norms that they claim they're so intent on preserving that they themselves violated over the course of the Trump tenure, with Russiagate being a paramount example. Now, is there a pretty straightforward case to be made against Trump? Meaning a case to be made in opposition to his reelection that doesn't rely on these catastrophist assumptions? Yeah, I think there pretty clearly is. Over the course of this remaining, whatever it is, 65 days or something, I am announcing this here and now. I'm going to be making a case against both Trump and Biden. I'm not going to make a pro case for either of them. And I'm not going to advocate that anybody vote for one or another candidate or no candidate. I'm simply going to lay out what I think is the most rational case that could conceivably be made against both candidates. And there's a very easy case that one can make against Trump. You could do it sheerly from the standpoint of administrative competence. And the only evidence that you need to justify that case is the COVID death toll. I know I'm going to get the hordes of denialists in this comment section who don't believe the data, don't believe that the pandemic is even a problem, disagree with Trump when he talks about the historic severity of the virus. Fine, you can operate in your own little dreamland. But I'm saying in terms of wide electoral palatability in terms of how the wider voting public would perceive it. There's just a simple, non-hysterical case that could be made in relation to whether Trump merits a second term. But you just don't hear that because it's always larded with this rhetoric about democracy on the verge of collapse, about our institutions crumbling, about how if Joe Biden doesn't get in office, we might as well say goodbye to America as we know it. And it's preposterous. Likewise, the catastrophist case against Biden is quite silly. And we heard that expressed over and over again at the Republican convention, where Biden gets depicted as though he is interchangeable with the radical left. And the case against Biden isn't even coherent. Like, they don't think that it's incumbent upon them to put forward an argument against Biden that is like internally consistent. So on the one hand, they'll denounce him for supposedly being the architect of mass incarceration, which Trump is dismantling. Trump didn't really exactly pledge in 2016 to dismantle mass incarceration, but that's what he's chosen to do, apparently. At least that's what they say he's chosen to do. So they denounce Biden for that, and they denounce Biden for having a racially disparate, they denounce Biden's policies for having a racially disparate effect on blacks in particular. And then they turn around and say that Biden is a radical anti-police leftist? Huh. So he's the architect of mass incarceration and also a radical anti-police leftist. I don't think that is particularly coherent, but then again, they're not even striving for coherence. Both parties are just jockeying for power. And so they don't feel any obligation to make a case has any remote semblance of internal consistency. They're just throwing whatever at the wall and seeing what sticks. So one thing I'm going to strive to do as the election season heats up here is to not indulge in catastrophist impulses coming in both directions. It's not rational. It makes people kind of nuts. Catastrophism, if you have read the book The Coddling of the American Mind, which I have on my shelf, by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, which I highly recommend, they get into catastrophism as a mental pathology that makes people fragile, where every slight, every hint of misfortune is then blown out of all proportion and can make you depressed, can make you anxious, can make you not able to withstand any adversity anymore, and then you demand that speech be curtailed in order to protect you. That's a similar impulse that we see now on display in both parties. The Democrats have been at it a little longer because Trump has been the object of it consistently now for 5 years or whatever. But the Republicans have their own version of it because neither of them can put forward a compelling case of anything now on their own terms. The catastrophist case against Trump was that he was going to bring in all these alt-right agitators, and he was going to institute white nationalist fascism. There was even a writer at The Economist today who put out a tweet. Let me read it to you so you don't think that I'm making this up. And I wouldn't blame you if you did assume I was making this up. This is Ryan Avent, columnist at The Economist, one of our most prestigious publications. He says, quote, It sounds absurd to say it, but America is in the process of choosing whether to be a white nationalist fascist state or an inclusive democracy. That's not hyperbole. That's just where we are. No, Ryan, I hate to break it to you, but that's just a tad hyperbolic. And it sounds absurd to say it because it is absurd. The idea that you could look out on 2020 America and say that the most accurate description of our political circumstances is that we all are living in a white nationalist fascist state, it's just self-evidently preposterous. But people like him just say it without even really justifying it. It feels emotionally right, I guess. And if you're incapable of making a sensible case against Trump that doesn't rely on that kind of utterly insane hyperbole, then number one, you're just analytically way off. You shouldn't be commenting on politics. You should comment on something else like, I don't know, video games. Or you are just a horrible political tactician. There's plenty of fodder for a reasonable case against Trump that doesn't hinge on this kind of ludicrous rhetoric. And the same goes for conservatives who want us to believe that Joe Biden is like the chief officer of Antifa. No. If Biden's going to be in hock to anybody, it's going to be the semi-permanent governing apparatus affiliated with the Democratic Party in the think tank world, the media world, the lobbying world, the advocacy world, to some extent the activist and union world, just as Trump is with the equivalent for the Republican Party. But that's not sexy. It's not scintillating to cast an election contrast in those terms. So we get this nonsensical histrionics nonstop shoved into our faces. I think it's not a particularly healthy thing. And to the extent that I can counteract it in my own little way here, then that is what I shall do. So there you have it. Going to see if I have any super chats here. P.A. Hurst, thank you for the super chat with no accompanying comment. Saves me some labor. John Smith says, with all due respect, 4 more years. If you say so, Mr. Smith. Donna says, I do find your reporting to be better valuable, even though I'm a conservative. I appreciate the actual reporting. Well, I appreciate that. I like to think that regardless of where you situate yourself on the political spectrum, you should be able to derive something of value from what I produce. And Me So Hungry says, just want to say hi. Well, hello to you. All right, buddy. Like I said, I have a Medium post which draws on these themes that I've just been discussing. That will be linked in the description box, as will be all the convenient ways in which you can contribute if you, again, find anything valuable in what I have to say or do or write. And with that, have a great day, great evening. Stay safe, stay cool. You know the drill. Doesn't change.